Hi, everyone. Give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Broken Rails 1153rd New Social Environment. I'm Min, the Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Stephen Cain, Jay Millar, Liz Worth, and Cole Swensen. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Jay Millar is the co-owner and co-publisher of BookHug Press, an award-winning Toronto-based independent literary publishing house working at the forefront of contemporary book culture. Jay is also an author and has published 7 collections of poetry, the most recent of which is I Could Have Pretended to Be Better Than You, new and selected poems. Liz Worth is a poet, novelist, and nonfiction writer. She is a 2-time nominee for the Relit Award for Poetry for her books, The Truth is Told Better This Way and No Work Finished Here, Rewriting Andy Warhol. Her writing has appeared in Flare, Prism, The Globe, among others. Liz is a professional tarot reader and lives in Hamilton, Ontario. Stephen Cain is the author of 6 full-length collections of poetry and a dozen chapbooks, including False Friends, I Can Say Interpellation, Zoom, Etc. Phrases, American Standard Canada Dry, Torontology, and Dyslexicon. He is also the author of multiple academic publications. He lives in Toronto, where he teaches avant-garde and Canadian literature at York University. And our host, Cole Swensen, is the author of 20 volumes of poetry, most recently And, which was long-listed for the Griffin Poetry Prize, and a collection of critical essays, Noise That Stays Noise. A former Guggenheim Fellow, she has been a finalist for the National Book Award and the LA Times Book Award, and has been awarded the Iowa Poetry Prize, the SF State Poetry Center Book Award, and the National Poetry Series. She has also translated over 20 volumes of poetry, prose, and art criticism from French and won the 2004 PEN USA Award in Literary Translation. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Cole to get us started.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. Big thanks to Jay and Liz and Stephen for joining us, and to the Brooklyn Rail and everybody there for making this work. This is a series, as many of you know, that is just here to thank and celebrate the people who give their time and energy to producing poetry. And they're, as you know, often writers themselves, so they're giving the time that they could be spending on their own work to help produce it for the rest of us. So really, really appreciate that. And we like to start with poetry, getting some creative work in the air. So today we're going to ask Stephen to read for us first, and then we'll be hearing from Liz.
Great. Thank you, Cole. Thank you, Min. Really happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me and Liz and Jay to talk about Book Hug and poetry in transit. I'm been involved with Book Hug for quite a while, and I've published a variety of things with them. So, for example, Jay publishes these interesting little chapbooks that I did. These are this is a translation of bpNichol. I also did a chapbook, translation of Gertrude Stein. He also published, him and Hazel with Book Hug, a faux children's book that I wrote with Dadaesque collages from Claudia Scala. They did a more academic publication of mine as well, my collection of bpNichol's early long poems, a critical edition, and my regular, more conventional books of poetry like False Friends that Min just mentioned, and then most recently, Walking and Stealing. And I'll do a short reading from Walking and Stealing, my most recent from Book Hug. I'll read one canto from the third section. It's a canto, 9 poems of 9 lines. So this is Tag and Run, Canto 1. No, I am not Madame Cézanne, nor was I meant to be. Those wine bottles in your neighbor's garden, have they begun to sprout? The art of work in the age of mechanical oppression. A future right turn, overwhelm your comfort zone, a lyric in flight. Reading Sherlock Holmes on my phone, private eye policing. Electricity comes from other planets. Everyone suddenly discovering infrathin. Soprano season, the bald-headed convertible, divers, drivers, sunburned quinquagenarian, too angry for grammar. Good things happen to bad people. Mark's metonymic moments. Consider the sex life of the lobster. Peterson's Patreon, go fuck me. Crowdsourcing corruption, make art or cut the rope. Fill the lack with patriotic acts. We turned the lights down low and had a hookah on the patio. The nattering of matter, curved airball, herbed suburb, the scent of dryer sheets, atomizes the atmosphere, blue screen moon, wild posting, rough sleeping. No need for Polaroids anymore. Allo Dobro. Uh-oh, 7. A carjack wrestler. Surfing bard. Weird is the word. Pay-per-view. Box sheets. Scandal tables. Don't let the bar stools grind you down. Nothing's normal. Nibiru rendezvous. An autumn inferno. Dante's d'entente. Taking a knee. Invest in oxygen. Suffocation time. Grievable debts. Fish and cut vape. A glabrous given to argue the guru. Don't be a poet at the picnic. Proletarian laughter. Relentless raccoons, simian imperialism. Churches convert into condos in a town without irony. Unsent by the sender. Days like these, it's easy to imagine the end. Asphalt around a tree, the work of a knucklehead. Dude with a Doberman, a hazmat splash pad, catastrophe actors, Hirohito Mon Amour. Never met an Ezra I liked. Our Virgo Viragos, be there with bells on. The blues clues a ploy and its fog. The problem with brunch at Tiffany's. Learning the dog's old tricks, milking the dinosaur to be cooler than capitalism. Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn it over now to the wonderful Liz.
Great, thanks, Stephen. That was awesome. It was great to hear you read again. I'm going to read from my new book, Inside Every Dream, a Raging Sea. This just came out in October. It's my third book with Book Hug, and I think it was actually 10 years ago that my first book came out this year. So we have a special anniversary this year, I guess. This is called Seven Seeds. A lot of the pieces in this book are just inspired by my sense of feeling of always having lived in cities, is that I find that city streetscapes are very oracular, and that there can often be a sense that we find we're almost in conversation with the streets and objects and all the things around us there. So this is called Seven Seeds. An old man came up to me on the street. His hair smelled of salt. He told me Tuesdays were for raising hell, Fridays for receiving grace. Then he puckered his lips as though for a kiss and blew warm breath against my forehead. He told me he had put 7 seeds inside of me. They can grow to become anything you wish, he said. He told me to wash my hands with cinnamon for 7 days to cleanse myself for the ritual. He also told me to wait for the first sign of pain to arrive, said it would come in the form of frost and the scent of regret. Every night after I bathed by candlelight, I let my hair stay heavy with oils. As I slept, it wove itself into hands that plucked feathers from my pillow. On the seventh day, I woke expecting dread. I watched the sky for omens and tried to stay inside. Nothing happened until late in the afternoon. There was pain, but it was different than I thought it would be. A fluttering cramp on my right side, and then exactly 10 hot tears, 5 from each eye. The first thing that grew was a memory I thought I had thrown away years ago. I won't tell you what it was. The second seed to sprout became a bent branch of lost time. I needed it back, except I didn't know what to use it for. On the third day, another seed broke open. This one was different than the rest, turning black in places and sprouting fuzz. This seed grew into a friendless year. I know what it's like to wait and have no one come. A temporary spirit arrived next. It was haunted by tortures and begged for help. Feed me with the glow of a match and a bowl of dirty water, it said. I cast the spell and the spirit became a white mare. The mare's hooves scattered the remaining seeds and I had to hunt for them under the couch. One seed had broken apart and I inhaled its contents. It offered nothing but dust, although later I laughed and something came out of me. Neediness and deceit, a part of myself I always wanted to send away. On the sixth day, a sound grew. It started as a distant humming and then became a song. Some feelings are so deep they can't be surfaced through language, only music or noise. The final seed bore something that had gone missing long ago. I only got a glimpse of her face as she left me, a witch mother maybe, fingers like roots, eyes the tides of a full moon. She ran as soon as she was freed, ran like she knew the moment was coming. Thank you.
Thank you both. Those were beautiful readings and just really great way to start the conversation. And I think now we're going to segue into some images and talk about the books, the real objects for a bit. So take it away, Jay.
My turn to just blather on, I guess. Yeah, no, thank you so much for having us. This is a really lovely thing to do. So I thought what I would do is just kind of run through some of the recent and forthcoming books that are coming out from Book Hug. I can sort of talk about them rather briefly, give you a sense of what the press is up to. This first book here is from one of our house writers, Jacob Wren. We worked with him on 4 or 5 books now. This came out last fall. It's called Dry Your Tears to Perfect Your Aim. Jacob is a really interesting writer where he will start working on a project and then the world will catch up to his thinking. He started working on this book 10 years ago and he was thinking about Syria at the time, but we released it last fall in the midst of everything that's been going on in the Middle East. It's about a writer who wants to know what his tax dollars are going to support wars in other places. So he goes there to find out. Jacob has always got this sort of interesting thumb on what's going on in the world in a way where he's interested in the intersection between capitalism and art in a variety of ways. Next slide. This, of course, is Liz's new book, Inside Every Dream, A Raging Sea. Liz is also one of our house authors. We've now worked with her on 3 books and have been working together for 10 years, which has been really exciting. She does a range of things. Her first book was a take on rewriting Andy Warhol's A into a 400-page plus book of poetry. And her second book was more lyrical and confessional. And this is very much in that realm as well, but also bringing in the notion of spell casting and the mythology of our lives in a sense. Next slide. This, of course, is Stephen's new book that he just read from, Walking and Stealing. Stephen and I have a love of baseball, and this uses the formality of baseball to create 3 sections of a book that are exploring the urban existence and like civil responsibilities, and it's very meditative and borrows all kinds of tropes from baseball, which I appreciate very much. Next slide. This is a translation that we work on. The very first book that we ever did as a trade publisher. We'd worked for many years as a micro publisher, but the very first book we ever did with the spine was from Denmark. And so we've since then been kind of, I don't know, we sort of have become the Can publisher. We have a very strong list of Scandinavian translations amongst us. Hanna Nordenhawk is one of Sweden's sort of amazing new writers that have come out. This is a very Gothic novel about the first woman who was ever born by a cesarean section. She's sort of captive. Her mother's died during the procedure, but she's sort of the ward of the doctor who's birthed her, who like owns her in a sense. So there's a lot of questions about women's bodies and men's control over them. And it's a very fascinating story in that regard. Next slide. This is another one of our translations from Quebec. We also publish, being from Canada, of course, we publish many books from Quebec. This is a historical novel, sort of. It takes place in the present, but it's about a little known and yet terrible nautical disaster that happened on the St. Lawrence River, where 1,400 people lost their lives when a Norwegian steamship broadsided another boat, and it sank in 14 minutes. And it happened in just before the outbreak of World War I and before the Titanic sank. So those kinds of things like overshadowed this historical moment. But it's a very interesting book where a story about a daughter who has a distant relationship with a mother who's died, and so she's looking into her past and discovers her relationship to this nautical disaster. Next slide. This is a very hybrid book. We love hybrid books at Book Hug. We started off primarily as a poetry press, but then moved into other genres as well. Poetry I find to be a very interesting genre because as soon as you call it poetry, then it tends to lose the general public's interest very quickly. So we discovered at one point that we could call a book of poetry something else, and then people would be very interested in it. And this is kind of launched into a number of books we've done that are very hybrid. And this is Christine McNair is another poet that we've worked with for a while. And she calls this a memoir. It's very much about her experience with what was once called toxemia, but is now known as preeclampsia. As she nearly died twice giving birth to her children. And so this book is a recounting of her experience within the medical system and her own experiences trying to give life while fighting for her own life, in a sense. Next slide. This is part of our essays series, which came out last fall. We've done a series of essay anthologies. This one follows another book that we did called Tongues, which investigates language and its place in the world. And this one is, the title kind of explains it very much. It's about second generation people who have come to North America but are from somewhere else. And so they're trying to negotiate those relationships to place where their families are from, where they live now, and what all of that means in a North American context. Next slide. No Credit River by Zoe Whittle. This is the first poetry collection that Zoe has done in many years. She's a rather big Canadian author. She's been shortlisted for major prizes and publishes her fiction work with multinational publishers. This is her first book of poetry in quite some time. She decided that she needed to get out from behind fiction. And she wanted to write this book about her experiences during the pandemic, about the loss of a relationship, about the loss of a pregnancy. It's a very vulnerable book, but filled with Zoe's unique sense of humor. She's also writes for television, like she wrote for Schitt's Creek and for the Baroness von Sketch Show, which is a Canadian sketch show that I highly recommend everyone to watch because it's hilarious. So she has a very interesting sense of humor that she brings to to her own personal story. Next slide. This is another translation from Quebec that's investigating class, and it's about and male fragility, actually. It's about a guy who decides that he has this near-death experience that isn't really a near-death experience, but it drives him to the point where he just can't seem to function, and then decides that he should buy a sugar bush to make his own brand of maple syrup. That's a very brief description of it, but it reminds me a lot of, it's about the collapse of a relationship and the way that something like Fleischman is in trouble. Reminds me of that book a little bit. Next slide. And this is Barber by Joni Murphy. I'm moving now into forthcoming books. I hope this isn't taking up too much time.
Oh, no, it's great.
No? Okay, that's great. Joni Murphy is another author that we worked with. She is an American author. We published her debut book in 2015 called Double Teenage. That was one of those amazing books that people got behind it before we even put it out. It got a big blurb from Chris Kraus, who just like nailed the book in terms of what it was all about months before we put it out. And so there was a great interest in this. She's, of course, working with other publishers in the US. We're her Canadian publisher. And this is her new novel that's, every time she writes a book, it's quite different. Her second book was called Talking Animals, which was about a bunch of animals living in New York, running the city. There are no humans in the world, and they're dealing with things like climate crisis and secret cabal, things run by cats. This book is very cinematic. It takes place in the 1940s and is about a woman who becomes a rather famous actress who's working with a very particular kind of director. It's a wonderful portrait of the world of Hollywood at that time, not to mention the sort of Oppenheimer kind of fascination that's been going on lately. The main character's father was involved in the Manhattan Project. We're very excited about this book, actually. Next slide. Iris and the Dead by Miranda Schreiber. This is a debut that came to us just out of the blue, and we just fell in love with it. It's a very poetic, it is kind of a hybrid book. It's like one of those novels. It's very fragmented and lyrical, but it's about a young woman who is, she has had a traumatic experience in her late teens, and so she's in therapy. And then that relationship between therapist and client, it collapses. There ends up being a romantic relationship between the two of them. And so years later, she's writing letters to the therapist, who she doesn't know anymore, about the trauma that she actually experienced in order to reclaim herself. It's a fascinating book. It has a style of its own that I can't even describe. And we're thrilled to introduce this new author to readers. Next slide. This is another translation from Quebec by Jean-Philippe Barrère-Guérard. We've worked with him in the past as well. This new book is all about the world of comedy, and has an amazing twist in it, in the sense of, like, you start to read it and then at one point it dawns on you who is actually speaking, which is not the main character, but the main character's girlfriend, who is also his agent. Anyway, it really gets into the whole back door world of the comedy world. This was actually made into a series that is in French, but it's pretty accurate to the novel for television. I don't know what else to say. It's translated by Neil Smith, who's a rather interesting author and translator, who brought this book to us. He said it was his favorite Quebec book of the year. So we needed to translate it. So we did. Next slide. This is one of our poetry collections that's coming out shortly. Shannon Webb Campbell's Rewild Her. Shannon is a mixed race Indigenous settler author here in Canada, and has been investigating that border of identity, but also about reclaiming things, reclaiming land, reclaiming water, reclaiming herself. It's a beautiful collection of lyric poetry. Next slide. And this is by Jessica Bebenak, who I'd better speak about nicely because I noticed she's on the call. This is her debut book of poetry. It's a very interesting take on time. There's two sections in the book. The first section is about a young woman, Jessica, who is caring for her aging grandfather in hospice while he's dying. And then, so there's a lot of poems from that perspective. And then the other set of poems revisits all of that, but from the future, from 10 years on. And so she's reflecting on who that person was and who they've become. And it's about care, it's about aging, it's about the circle of life. So we're really excited about this, Jessica. So I'm glad to speak about it here. Next slide. This is a debut novel by poet Ben Ladouceur. We love novels written by poets. I'm sorry that I'm pitching, not pitching, I'm not pitching anything. I'm sorry that I'm discussing so many novels, but we did start out as a poetry press, and we do have this kind of thing about genre. It's kind of problematic in a way, but um, poets who write novels is always a delight. This actually takes place in Montreal in two time periods, 1967 and 1977, and is investigating. The main character is a young man who moves to Montreal from the East Coast, comes out as queer, uh, documents his relationships about people that he meets around Expo 86 that's taking place in Montreal at the time. And then 10 years later, it's investigating or recounting. There's a bar called Trucks that was a gay bar that was raided by the police, and so it's recounting that moment in time. So it's kind of like a historical novel. It's talking about a queer identity and queer rights from pre-Stonewall, which is really quite interesting. Ben did a lot of research, speaking with people who were at Trucks to get the background information that he needed in order to write the story. We're really excited about this book, actually. It's quite a lovely book. Next slide. And this is another book where we're the Canadian author of. Tree Abraham is actually one of our in-house designers. She lives in Brooklyn. She's originally from Ottawa. We did another book of hers a few years ago called Cyclettes, which was a love letter to every bicycle that she's ever owned. As a book designer, she has a very hybrid way of writing that's very visual. So there's lots of imagery and graphics that she's created and things that she's found that are woven into the text. Really lovely stuff, actually. This book is about an unrequited relationship. So it kind of begins where love stories usually end. And she fell in love with one of her roommates, and it was an unrequited love, and yet they decided to maintain their relationship. So she's created this idea of the else-ship. These are different kinds of relationships that are very loving and very close. And she's documented this in this visual memoir. Next slide. And this is the Fun Times Brigade. I can't remember if this is the last book on the list here or not, but Lindsay is another author that we've worked with. This is her sophomore novel. It takes place in the world of children's performance. So I don't know if Sharon, Lois, and Bram means anything to anybody, but that was a very big Canadian children's performance group. And so she has kind of like gone into this world, and she's writing about a woman who's just had her first child. She's been part of the Fun Times Brigade, which is a children's performance group, a rather famous children's performance group. And she's trying to balance new motherhood with her career, while also dealing with the fact that she had dreams of being an independent musician when she was younger, but then accidentally fell in with this group. And this is what she's become. She does not have a solo career. So it's kind of negotiating all that kind of stuff. I will say this is, it's got a very interesting, we got a lot of feedback from our sales reps because there's this one moment where she's talking about a particular kind of chalk that mathematicians in academia buy and use. And people knew what she was talking about, and it caused this massive conversation, this huge email thread amongst our sales group as they were like chatting about this chalk. I don't know why I'm bringing it up here. It's not really what the novel's about, but it's just an interesting moment that has happened with this book. Is there anything else after this, or have I kind of gone through everything?
These are all the book covers that you
Yeah.
shared.
So these are the books that we released last fall and that we're preparing for release now. And that's kind of an overview of what's going on at the press at the moment.
Great, thank you. That gave us a really good sense of the range and what a range. It's quite amazing. And the interest in hybridity and sort of an active genre is really fun to see.
Yes.
Maybe we should stop sharing the screen at this point and go back to our full faces and start talking more about the press. I was interested in the fact that it started out as Book Thug and segued into Book Hug. And I wondered if you could talk about the original impulse, the change, and how that might parallel other changes in the evolution of the press.
Yeah, sure. Yes, I mean the press actually had a different name originally altogether, which was Boondoggle Books, which was the when I first started publishing, that was the imprint that I was using. I had discovered the mimeopress revolution at the library, like Bill Bissett's Blue Women Press was a huge influence on what I was doing, but also found all kinds of other small press things. And so I started my own imprint. And then that changed to Book Thug at one point. The name Book Thug comes out of a poem by a poet that I was working with at the time. He talked about you know, poets hanging out on street corners arguing over language and used the term book thug to describe them. And it seemed like a really great name for a press that was kind of interested in how language shifts around and there is no center and people, you know, poets are always arguing over what makes a good poem. So it seemed like kind of like a good name and it did serve us well for a number of years, you know, while irony still existed. And but then we started to get some messages from people that for my wife and I, who are both look like this, to be using the word thug in our name was not good. There was another instance in Canada where there was a cookbook that was called Thug Kitchen. That was I think it's an American book, but it was published in Canada by an NSE, I think. And the authors of that turned out to be two white guys who were using like gangsta lingo to promote vegetarian cooking. And so, of course, the identity politics around that erupted. And that was around the same time that we started to hear burblings as well about our name. The first place that I really heard anything about it was when I went to AWP for the very first time, which was in Seattle. And that was around the time that there was a football player for the Seahawks that was complaining about the use of the word thug to describe African American athletes in the media. And there have been pieces that have been written. We started to do a lot of talking with people and a lot of thinking about this. I actually looked into the etymology of the word thug, which actually comes out of India, the cult of Thuggee, which are the stranglers, like they murdered 1 million people without spilling a drop of blood. And then when Britain colonized India, then that word kind of moved to Britain and became associated with soccer thugs and gangsters and things like that. And then it moved to the United States. And then when we started seeing Trump describe groups of people as thugs, we were like, this is not good. And so while we were trying to figure things out, we put an asterisk over the T as a kind of marker that we were thinking about this and that and we actually went through an entire process. We hired a consultant to think about a name change, what that might be, went through all of those exercises. And while that was going on, we got a lot of feedback about how great that asterisk was, that it was a very subversive move to just simply cover the T up, leave a marker there that meant that we weren't erasing history, but we were acknowledging it. And in our minds, it's become like a little bit of a door handle or something that you could open the door and see a bit of a story there. And then we really loved that we'd found the hug and thug. I think it, you know, for all of the arguments that poets make, I don't think I've ever seen any fist fights. I've heard rumors of one at a reading series in Toronto in the 90s, but that was the 90s. And I also love that we found the risk and asterisk, little things like that, you know, and I think that the ethos of the book hug, there are people that still you call it book thug, and kind of as I don't know what to call it, refusal that things change. But I found it fascinating that for a press that was interested in how language has no center, and that it evolves and that things change, I found it completely fascinating that it actually happened to our name.
Yeah.
We had to sort of like, you know, listen and make a decision about something. And I think we made the right decision.
It says a lot about your sort of interaction with community, that you're
Mhm.
taking in the surrounding community's responses and ideas
Mhm.
and willing to go with them. It seems like there's a lot of interface going on there and gives us a really interesting sense of again, the range of consideration. I was also interested in your use of the term a house writer or a house,
Mm.
which also seemed to say something about commitment and community, that you make a commitment to certain writers. And since both Liz and Stephen, you seem to be house writers, I wondered if you could just tell us something about your experience of working with both specifically Book Hug, but also the notion of commitment and community.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just listening to Jay talk about the name change and how much I respect that gesture and that it was a brave thing to do and that, during the time when the Black Lives Matter things were happening in the poetic community, some groups dug in and refused to listen, refused to change. Whereas Jay and Hazel listened and did this um the idea of the hug as an embrace, right? As bringing in as well as affection for the things. And I've felt hugged by Book Hug in the time I've been publishing with them. I've been publishing with them, as I said right from the beginning. Um, it feels like a family in certain ways, right? The idea that sometimes they say the Book Hug family because Jay's partner Hazel's is part of the press and their son Reed is part of the press. And I've been lucky to be brought in with that as well. So I appreciate that, the generosity of them as publishers. And I guess the third thing that they take risks and they're willing to do all sorts of things. They've allowed me to do chapbooks. They've allowed me to do these children's books that are satirical and somewhat edgy. They've allowed me to do my regular poetry. They've allowed me to do academic titles or more kind of things. So they're a great press to work with. They're generous. They're adventurous, and I feel lucky to work with them.
You want to add to that, Liz?
Yeah, I think I would reiterate everything Stephen said. It's interesting because when I started with Book Hug, I had done this great conceptual poetry project of rewriting Andy Warhol's A, as Jay had mentioned, and turning that into poetry. And uh, after that, I was the kind of person who believes that sometimes art finds us, and there are times when we might be forcing something into an idea. So if we're doing something very conceptual, then we're deciding what a project will become before it actually exists. And then other times it's as though ideas choose us and we're just responding or reacting to our inspiration. And I think it's important for artists to be able to do both. But it's getting hard to do that in this world because everything at this point in time is so very much about finding your niche and replicating success. And we see that in the arts industries. We also see that on things like social media, where so many people now just make accounts and they do the same thing every day, every day, every day. And your account is about a certain topic, and you have to just stick to that certain topic and continue to repeat yourself because that's what you're going to become known for. And it gets really boring. But I also understand why people do it is because there's something in human nature where we look for predictability and we seek out what we like. And it's hard sometimes to follow people who go off on different paths and who are exploring different ideas and who aren't always doing the same thing that you liked them doing last time. But Book Hug has always made space for that kind of art and those types of artists. And that's what I think is so interesting about it and so exciting about it is that Jay and Hazel continue to really champion and celebrate work that is often doing art for art's sake. And I think that's really lacking these days.
I was interested, Stephen, in your mentioning the academic and the children's books and this great sort of overflow and range, again, of what you do. And Liz, I know you have a similar, I mean, very different set of things that are overflowing out of your poetry practice, particularly performance. I think. Would you want to talk a little bit about that performance project that you had for a couple of years?
Oh, I've had several performance projects over the years, and performance for me has always been a really important part of poetry. And it's one of the reasons why I've been drawn to poetry because I grew up very immersed in punk and goth subcultures, and that was where I often encountered a lot of poetry, actually. And there were a lot of people, or at least I perceive there to be a lot of people. I don't think it's actually a huge a huge group, but there has often been a crossover between spoken word, performance, literature, music. I've always gravitated towards artists who are not confined to one genre or one type of expression. And so for me, performance has always been an important part of my poetry practice. And it's always something that I have enjoyed doing as an added avenue onto the writing. So I've had several projects where I've combined poetry with sound or music. And I try to continue to do that in different ways. I don't have a specific project happening right now, but I sometimes collaborate with other musicians and things like that. And I've had the opportunity to do that through Book Hug as well when we did a little 7-inch record. I think it was in 2018, maybe.
Yeah, it was around then, yeah.
Yeah, around there with a band called the Zeus Twins from also from Toronto, I
Yeah, they're here
believe.
in
Yeah,
Toronto.
yeah, and that was a great opportunity to again to explore the ways that that poetry can be rhythmic and lyrical and to coincide with music. And again, I think there's always more room for those types of things to happen. There should be more crossover between these different arts worlds rather than everybody sticking to their own categories.
Yeah, I mean, it is, sorry, Cole.
Mm.
It is fascinating to me how things get kind of like siloed into these different things, you know, and even within the world of poetry, there's silos, you know, like there's the spoken word thing that's happening over here, and then there's the spoken word people refer to people like me as a page poet. And I find it interesting that there's not a lot of mixture going on. So we have tried a few projects to try and do that. Liz has sort of mentioned the 7-inch record. We had this idea came to us from Andrew Whiteman, who is one of the members of Broken Social Scene. But he is fascinated with poetry and had started this thing called sonic poetry, I think, where he was working with like Anne Waldman and other poets that he very much admires and trying to like mix poetry and music together. He actually did an album that's based on In the Pines by Alice Notley, that's by his band Aurora that he did with his partner Ariel, which is a fantastic album. But he sort of brought this idea to me, and then we managed to get some funding that would allow us to create these 7-inch records. Now we did 3 of them. Liz did one of them. Jacob Wren did another one, and a poet named Jennifer Lovegrove did another one. And we paired them with different musicians and to see what they could come up with. And some interesting things came out of it, like thinking about the A side versus the B side. What are the 2 sides of your book? What are the 2 sides of your writing? And like, how does that get represented? Other interesting things that happened is that record stores couldn't have cared less that we made these records, and bookstores couldn't have cared less that we'd made these records. So it became kind of like a strange thing where like the genre of commerce kind of got in the way of the records of what the project was. So we still have quite a few copies of these kicking around, but it was a really exciting project to work on, and you know, brought some other considerations to things for sure.
And I believe we have some slides of those record covers. Is that right?
Wait, I sent a picture of
Yeah,
the
let's
record.
look at that and tell us a little bit more about that. And then I'd love to hear about your collaborative book, Stephen and Jay, that you wrote together.
Sure. Yeah, so these are the three records here. Liz's is on top. And Beautiful Children with Pet Foxes is another poetry collection. They all have the same title as the poetry collection. Jacob's is kind of unique because it was a novel that he was reading from. His strange book, Rich and Poor, which is about a guy who decides he needs to kill billionaires in order to send a message to the world, which is kind of weirdly topical at the moment. Jacob's been getting a lot of emails about the guy who killed the CEO of the health organization, asking them like, why is this so much like your book? But he worked with Andrew Whiteman directly on this. They were really exciting projects to do. I loved how we were able to kind of bring together different areas. We invented a name for it. Chaos and Star was the name of the imprint. I don't know which one is the poet and which one is the musician, Chaos or Star, but they've come together to do these things. There's a series that happens in Toronto that's run by a musician named Jason Collette that he calls the Basement Review. And he brings musicians and writers together. And I was at a number of those before we worked on this. And I realized how different it is listening to a writer read their work and listening to a musician play their work. Like musicians are cool. They know how to be on stage. They know how to work a mic. They've got a guitar or something that they can like, manipulate with them. And then the poet would get up to read, a poem about something precious to them, and paper's just kind of shaking in front of the microphone. And Jason would actually have to get the audience to stop and listen to the poets, which I thought was really fascinating because they don't have to stop and listen to the musicians in the same way. Um, there was a lot of questions around listening that I also wanted to investigate with this series. I would have loved to keep going, but it's expensive to make records.
And what you're saying about, in fact, instead of generating interest in both the book and the record world, it did the opposite. Is a really
Yeah, it kind of fell in the middle somewhere, like they're still available for sale on our website, and sometimes people buy them. It still happens. But I think because it just doesn't fit so well into those like we live in a world of categories, right? Like, and it's something that I've learned as a publisher is that categories are king. When you are going to market a book, you have to choose the right code so the bookstore will know what section to put it in. And like there's all kinds of like these weird things that are kind of controlling how books are perceived through the marketplace. And they're not great, especially for anybody that's like working in a hybrid kind of position, becomes kind of confusing when you do a memoir that also works like a book of poetry. Like, what do you do with that? And more often than not, they get stuck in the poetry section. But we are always insisting that they can go in other places. So, yeah.
I was thinking another category is the author's name. And certainly when we put a book on a shelf, it's often alphabetically. So what do you do when you've got two authors in a single book?
True.
Stephen, do you want to talk a little bit about the collaborative book that the two of you did and what that's felt like in terms of its interface with the world?
Sure. Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, always been interested in collaboration. It's hard to find a person you can trust and to work with in collaboration and certain projects. But I had met Jay through the small press scene and through grad school, and we developed a friendship, not just based on the writing that we enjoyed, but just a personal friendship. And we were both living in Toronto, but I was moving to Kingston for a year, and this was around the time when early internet and email popularity, and so we thought we'd have a sort of email correspondence, writing back and forth to each other in this kind of poetic way. And the book was marketed as microfiction or flash fiction or a novel, but I'm not really sure it is that. I kind of see it as poetic prose. Um, I'll let Jay explain the structure in a minute, but it was a call and response. It was an antiphonal kind of thing where I would send a poem, and then Jay would write a poem in response, and then we would go back and forth. And it was alphabetic. Uh, so we went through the alphabet, and we did it twice. When it actually was published, it's published as a do book. So there's one cover, and then you flip it over on the other side, and there's the book runs from one side into the middle. So it's like I'm not explaining it well, but it's called do. Two books coming in towards the middle. And looking at it now, it's prose poetry, it's meditative, it's about friendship, it's about masculinity. It kind of feels, even though I didn't know this at the time and I wouldn't make a claim for this, almost like early auto fiction or auto theory or a male version. I don't want to claim that, a very gendered genre is to co-opt that, but we're doing the same kind of thing, like talking about our families. Jay had his first child, and this was a mixed genre. They were prose poems, and again, autobiographical or communicative. And we get to a sort of a third mind where we weren't really writing. Sometimes I felt like I was writing like him, and sometimes he felt like he was writing me, and then sometimes it was this third mind that was in the book as well. So, Jane, could you talk a little bit more? You came up with the constraint of the alphabetic call and response. Maybe you could, I don't know
Yeah,
where that came from or why, but it worked.
I think at the time I was actually reading the double helix. I was kind of fascinated with, I think it was around the time that they'd mapped the human genome. And so I was kind of fascinated with genetics and the idea of the double helix. And so that I realized in my reading of the double helix that it's a code, right? Like there's only what, 4 letters, 6 letters that are sort of representative of the thing, and they always match up with each other, but in a very long strand. So there's a meeting of letters, right? That happen in that code. And so in our code, we just use the alphabet, and we each started with A, and we would have to come up with a title that started with that letter, and then we would write the piece under it and send it to each other, and then would have to respond to that with a piece that was titled with a word that started with the letter Z. And then we would work through the whole alphabet. So we were working back and forth at the same time. And so the whole structure of the thing in its do-se-do thing is like the first poem is an A poem, and then you turn the page and it's a Z poem, but it's by somebody else, right? So that's where all the blurring came from. And I love how it kind of like goes to the space in the middle, like Stephen said. It's kind of great. And when some people were reviewing it, they would quote Stephen and say it was me, or they would quote me and say it was Stephen. I love that nobody could really figure it out. It was kind of delightful. Yeah.
Good. It looks gorgeous too. I love the
Yeah, I
vibrancy.
noticed that Stephen took this picture and he put the side that's got him on the top. And I do love how the designer actually, one side is Francis Crick and one is Watson. You know,
Okay.
the image of the two guys there that are supposedly the people that discovered DNA, although they're not. It was a third person who's not really mentioned very much, who happens to be a woman,
Oh,
who actually
interesting.
who actually provided the inspiration that then they came up, they wrote the paper and got all the credit. So
A frequent story.
yeah,
We're running a little bit out of time, and I wanted to make sure that we touched on internationalism because that seems like
Hmm.
a really important aspect with the interest in translation, and you're just sort of uh, local commitments, but also a global outreach. And maybe we could stop sharing the screen and just talk about that a little bit. And
Sure.
if Liz and Stephen, you want to pop in with ideas too, please do.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned in my little preamble with some of the books, the very first trade book we ever did was a book from Denmark. Uh, so this kind of internationalism, and Stephen actually wrote the introduction to that book, now that I think about it. Uh, it was a poet I'd never met. I got a phone call from the assistant to the director at the festival here in Toronto, and they do countries of focus often, and they were doing a Danish focus. And so they were inviting all of these authors to Toronto, and some of them didn't have books in English. So they were desperately looking for Canadian publishers who would be willing to receive a chunk of money from the Danish Arts Council and put out a book in English. I was the only one who succeeded in actually using that money to publish a book. And strangely enough, I was actually working at another company at the time. I was working for Coach House Books as their poetry editor, and they weren't interested. I brought the project to them. That's how it came to me as the poetry editor there. And they said, no, that doesn't really fit with what we want to do. And I said, would you care if I did it with my little imprint, which at that point was just Book Thug, the chapbook press. And they said, go ahead. So I went in after hours and typeset this book called Pencil of Rays and Spiked Mace, the selected poems of Niels Lingshow, and translated by an American named Gregory Pardlow, who 10 years later won the Pulitzer.
Yeah.
And there was suddenly some interest in that book 10 years after publication as a result. But as a result of that, we just suddenly had ties with Scandinavian publishers. And so we've always maintained ties with them and have continued to publish translations. It's a pet project for us. I confess that it doesn't make a ton of money. And it's a lot of work and very expensive to do translations. But it is a great adventure. And I love that in this very strange world where borders are very loose because of the internet, but very tightened because of politicians, that translation transcends those things. And I love bringing things from other places. It widens the scope in the same way that I love promoting something that's very local because it provides grounding. And I love that conversation between things. I think that Canada has had a national project of creating a national literature, which has been a very strange thing to watch, especially recently with changes that have been going on in the community and in the market. But actually doesn't work. Like Canada is too large and has too many geographical differences in terms of community in order to really have a national literature. We have two languages here. We have two separate markets for books. Like it's a very different kind of space to try and create a national identity. And I think that's part of the Canadian identity is that as soon as you think you know what it is, it changes 5 seconds later, which is kind of interesting space to be creating things in. But I love that by bringing voices from other places, then you can create a conversation that's much larger than just what's happening on the local. That's what excited me about the initial parts of what went on when the internet came about. I could connect with people from other places that weren't the local. I don't know if that's had anything to do with the sort of recent, what I would think of as a kind of strange collapse of on the ground community. I've had thoughts about how I know people from around the world better than I know my own neighbors, which is kind of an interesting space to be in. But anyway, I'm rambling a bit now, but
Well, thank you for those ramblings because they covered a lot of territory. Liz or Stephen, do you want to say anything about? I'm interested in this notion of the attempt at a national literature that fails and how that failure might actually point to some strengths such as diversity. But I'd love to hear Liz or Stephen talk about that. Do you want to start, Liz?
Yeah, oh gosh. This is a big question. Um, Canada is a funny place because and I don't know, how many people on this call are from Canada or understand the Canadian context, and how many of you are from elsewhere. So I'll try to, I don't know, I'll try to speak to it as best I can. But Canada's a funny place because we don't really celebrate a lot of our major cities here. And that is for me has often been a problem in my work as a writer, but also in terms of I think as an artist looking for certain resonance within our culture. And so for me, Canada has always had a bit of an identity crisis because of that. We have a very strong awareness of American culture, and I don't know if this is accurate, but from the outside looking in, it often doesn't look like the US has as much of a problem celebrating Los Angeles or celebrating New York City. Whereas here, if there's a big city like Toronto, everybody, or not every, I shouldn't say everybody, but there's often a certain wall that goes up around allowing sometimes artists from a big city like Toronto to be celebrated nationally, because there's this argument that we have to be upholding smaller towns or rural communities, and I think that causes a lot of friction a lot of the time, because it gives the sense that there isn't enough room for everybody at the table, and unfortunately, artists tend to gravitate towards urban centers because it's where things are happening. If you want to go to a poetry reading, you're probably going to find a lot of poetry readings happening in Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver. You're not going to find it in a small farm town in Northern Ontario. Right. And so for me, I've always found Canada to be a funny place for that because we have so much resistance and so much hesitancy around just acknowledging what's actually happening and allowing ourselves to be excited about it. And there can be, for whatever reason, sometimes, a lot of animosity between our rural culture and our urban culture here. And I think that it can become really hard for us to even figure out what do we want to be promoting, upholding? What is our voice? Who's representative of that voice? If right away we're trying to figure out who's allowed in that and who isn't. But when it comes to even looking at authors outside of Canada, it also makes a lot of sense because Canada is so diverse, and we have so many ways that we celebrate cultures outside of Canada, but at the same time we have a hard time celebrating the things that come from within. And so I've always found that to be a little bit of a puzzle here, because I think that we're always trying to figure out what it is that we really want to be saying, and who we want to be showcasing, and how we want to be doing that. And we don't give ourselves enough credit sometimes in terms of the strength of the artists that we have.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I mean, I think Liz was, pointing to a lot of the issues, that it's difficult to be a publisher in Canada for a lot of different reasons, and part of the way publishing is funded, the provincial interests versus the federal interests, and the language issues, as was pointed out. And in the history of small press in Canada, I think it's been a challenge to be a publisher in Toronto and in Ontario, because the other presses in the other provinces can brand themselves as this is what we do. We do Vancouver writers, we do Prairie writers, we do French writers. Whereas when you're in Ontario, you can't say, oh, we just do Ontario writers, we want to do everybody. But then there's a suspicion about you, or there's something that you're centrist or whatever. And so I think Jay and Hazel have done a really great job of like moving from a Toronto locus to opening up. I think one of the other early proper bound books she did was Lisa Robertson. So bringing in the Vancouver KSW, she's now in France, but that nexus, and then doing the translations of Quebec writers, so bringing in Quebec, and then starting to publish Indigenous writers, Lee Miracle, doing Black writers, expanding, and then going outside to get European and American writers, which don't get funded by the Canadian publishing industry. So they're taking risks on doing these things as well. So it's a tenuous game, right? There was a book about the Canadian small press scene. I forget what it was called. It was Roy McSkimmings. But anyway, the cover of it is a guy on a tightrope trying to walk this perilous trade, right? And I think Jay and Hazel did an amazing job balancing these things in this perilous trade. And just to say, when they do acquire these books from Europe or America, there is also a book kind of style to that. They're not just going for a big name, or they're just not going for a celebrity. They actually sort of think and vet and see how that fits within a kind of book hug aesthetic, so you can trust the book hug brand as they internationalize in a sense. So
great.
No, thanks, Steve.
Wonderful. We're top of the hour and a little bit beyond, so we should move on to the Q&A. But thank you all, Stephen, Liz, Jay. It's really got a lot of things in the air to think about, and I imagine we have a number of questions and comments. So I'll turn it over to you, Min, to negotiate that.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, everyone. That was such a fun conversation to listen. Just a reminder, in the chat, we're sending a link so you can submit your question, comments, and I'll be able to read it for you, or you can ask the questions. To Jay, Liz, and Stephen. Our first question is from Doreen. I notice the genres in your submission guides do not include hybrids. If my work is prose with poems woven in, how do I submit it? She also expressed her gratitude for the conversation.
I mean, I guess I'm confused, just in the sense that like I don't care about the genre particularly. Yes, we do say that there's poetry. Yes, we do say that there's fiction. Yes, we do say that there's nonfiction. But if there's something that falls between that, then just outline that in your introductory letter that we ask for, and just say like, this is an intergenre work that's exploring the genres of poetry and prose, and this is what the book is about. And then you can, I think that we use kind of a submittable sort of thing. So I think it asks you to choose the genre. So just choose the genre that you think it might fall closest to. Like if it's more prose with poetry woven in, maybe it's more like fiction or nonfiction. That's up to you, but we're not too particular. We won't not read it.
Thank you, Jay. I have a question for all of you. I was curious to hear a little bit more about your translation process and how translation plays part in your practice as a publisher, but also how that weaves into your writing practice. Jay, you mentioned your interest in publishing translations of, I believe, Scandinavian books,
Mhm.
but and Liz, there seems to be this like translation between or translation of performance and thinking about time-based sort of work and moving that or bringing that into your writing practice and even your work with tarot cards. I feel like there's this like sort of fun intersection of translatory like process involved. And Stephen, you mentioned your interest in baseball and how that maybe that's more like metaphor, but even that kind of all of your interest kind of translates into your writing practice and how that informs your right or your writing as a poet and novelist. I'm interested to hear more about all three of your opinions on how that process informs your writing.
Sure,
Sure.
yeah, not just yeah. You mentioned the baseball. I was quite interested in what's called homolinguistic translation, so translation within a set language, so English to English, for example. And so I did two of those as chapbooks with Jay. I took Gertrude Stein's uh, poem from Tender Buttons Rooms, which is a single block of text, like it looks like prose, and translated it into verse uh, by association. So it was a text called stanzas. So I took that poem and made it sort of lineated verse. For the bpNichol one, I took his concrete poems, so his visual poems, and translated those into lyric poems. So it's kind of ekphrasic, right? Because it was a kind of visuality that was being translated into lyricism, but also had letter forms in it as well. So playing with that within the language, and again, that book hug was interested, yeah, not only in just translating French Quebec writers or Danish writers, but was open to homolinguistic translation as well. And both those were in my book False Friends that I did just before this recent book with Book Hug. So yeah, Liz.
Yeah, I mean, with, in terms of tarot and translation, I always say that, I mean, tarot has always been a part of my life, and so it's hard for me to separate tarot or esoteric practices, to separate them out of any type of creative process that I've had, even if the work I'm doing isn't always directly reflective of that, just because when you start to look at something like tarot or even astrology, you're thinking in a symbolic way. And with tarot, especially, you're looking at an image and you're translating that image into language, right? It's why sometimes people find it can be hard to learn tarot because we're so used to relying on text for information. When you start to look at a picture and you have to put words around that picture and derive some kind of meaning from it is like learning a different language. And so I think that tarot and writing, especially poetry, actually work together really, really well because both of them force you to think symbolically and to think metaphorically. And so even though they can exist in completely different worlds and can be and don't always cross over. I find for me there's always been a very, very easy flowing coexistence between the two. And I always tell people if you can write, you can do tarot and vice versa.
Nice. I mean, I'm going to speak about it more from the publishing side, just because I don't actually, I mean, I'm fascinated by the idea of translation. I always have been, and yet I am sort of hopelessly monolinguistic. Uh, I remember the first time that my wife and I went to France, I was silent for 3 days out of a kind of Canadian guilt of not actually knowing French. to the point where Hazel was kind of asking me, like, why are you not talking to me? But I was trying to hide the fact that I didn't know French very well. I know French a little bit now because of the work we've been doing with translation. And so I think, and I've been trying to learn Danish, which is a super impossible language. It's got like 27 vowels, which is bonkers, and shifts around. I can't seem to make heads or tails of it. So I have this desire to engage with the idea of translation. And so I'm very happy that I'm able to do this through the publishing program that we have. Yeah. And that's why I tend to work with, there's quite a few authors that I've worked with who are also translators. So I was very lucky early on that people like Erin Moray or Juana Vasilichioy or Amy Wall or any of the translators that we work with who are from Quebec, they bring us projects. They're on the ground there. They know what's going on. This is what interests them. So they will bring a project to us and that we can work on. And the same thing has started to happen internationally. We've made excellent connections with translators from all over the world, and they will pitch us things that they think are really interesting. And then we take that under consideration for our own program. So it's just wonderful to be able to work in these different cultural realms through the act of engaging with translation. Yeah, I think that's what I'll say about it.
Thank you, Jay. Our next question is from Charlie. Jay and Stephen both worked in the antiquarian book trade where a book's rarity often comes into play. Has that affected the book hog's practice and aesthetic?
The rarity of a book? I don't know. I mean, when I was starting the press, it's true. When I was, first publishing, I was working at, I was managing the rare book room at a bookstore here in Toronto, and engaging with some of those early small press things, like it was called Contact Editions, which was named after, strangely enough, there's a Contact Press here in Canada, which was run by Ray Souster and Louis Dudek and Irving Layton. But there was also the Contact Press in Europe that was a very early modernist press, published Mina Loy's first book, Robert McCalman, like, sort of lost generation sort of authors. But looking at the aesthetic of those things kind of informed me in a sense of like what I wanted the chapbooks that I was doing at the time to look like. And then even that very first book that I did from Denmark, it doesn't look like a book. It's got a spine. There's nothing on the wrapper. Like on the covers, I hand tipped title plates onto it. There's no barcode. Like it's kind of missing all of the stuff that industry requires of a book. And so this kind of aesthetic affected things in a way early on, but that's changed as we've become more and more engaged with the market. We do think about cover design in different ways now. We do think about how to market these unmarketable things in different ways, ways that we can generate conversation about it that we hope will, make the book less rare than simply printing it. It took me a long time to figure out. It took me 10 years to figure out that publishing means to make public. It's not making a book. And so 95% of what we do at the press is about publicity and marketing. And the rest of it is the making of the book part, which is still super important. We hook up all the authors with editors and designers and the whole bit, but at least 90% of what we're doing here is just trying to make sure that people know about stuff.
I mean, your earlier books, before they were proper bound, that were often deluxe editions, right? They were signed or they were numbered or they had some special embossing or kind of, I think this is the kind of stuff that Charlie's talking about. And then as you became more publishing in bigger runs and things like that, that sort of, and like a press like Coach House still sometimes does these deluxe editions or these lettered editions or numbered editions. And that's not really something that you've done. Is that kind of like what you were saying about the records, that when you do create a sort of preciousness about the object, that the bookstores are less interested rather than more interested in them?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I mean, one of the things that's been really interesting is that in 2021, we signed an agreement with Independent Publishers Group in the US to handle our sales and distribution there. And that was a really interesting moment because their press base is very trade orientated. We, at the time, were one of a handful of literary presses that they published. And so we had to actually start to think about how we were marketing our books a little different at that time. What they were going to look like, how they were going to engage with the market, how we going to talk about them, all that kind of stuff. We have done, like, there was a series that I had that was called Moments Cafe, that was about doing limited edition something or other. I think the most famous one is a poem that we published by Derek Beaulieu that's called Prose of the Trans-Canada, which is this giant poster of a visual poem that was done in enough editions that it would be exactly the same height as the Calgary Tower, because it was based on a Blaise Cendrar's thing that if you extended those, it would be the same height as the Eiffel Tower in Paris. But yeah, even those, they sell very slowly, and it's a very niche-y kind of thing. Yeah, it's like with the press having grown to this where it is now, and the kind of international marketing that we're trying to do, those projects are harder to have the person power to do, in a sense. Yeah.
Thank you, Jay. Our last question for all of you is, what's next for Book Hug, and what are you most excited about?
Good. My goodness. What are the two authors you're most excited about?
I like your new season coming up. I'm looking forward to reading Jessica's book. So good on you.
I'm excited. We just celebrated our 20th year last year. And I think that, I mean, there were 3 or 4 publishers that all started at the same time that Book Hug started doing trade publishing. I mean, the very first book I ever did was a self-published chapbook that came out in 1992. So that's how long I've been kind of at the game. But since 2004, there were 2 other presses that I know of that started at the same time. One is called Biblioasis, which is a publisher in Windsor, Ontario, south of the United States. That's the space that they're in, being south of Detroit. But and there was another book press called Chaudière Books in Ottawa that was started by Rob McLennan and his partner Christine. And then actually there was another one called Snare Books that was doing very small poetry. They had a kind of series that if they felt like chapbooks, but they had spines and were very small, kind of pocket-sized books. And Biblioasis and Book Hug are the 2 presses that managed to make it through. The other 2 presses no longer exist in the same capacity. They've both their backlists were bought up by another press who now handles those titles. But so I just feel very lucky to be here, honestly. Publishing is a really strange game. It's the weirdest industry in the world, but it's filled with a lot of adventure. And I wouldn't trade it for anything, but there are many challenges. And I think right now we're in a moment of challenge. There's a lot of challenge about literary work. I think things have become very mainstream in some strange way. I've had many conversations with my 26-year-old son who doesn't believe that the underground exists anymore. The internet has changed all that in such a drastic way. And we also live in this very strange world of what I would call memery. Things are just repeated a lot. And there's something that's going on that I think is going on. Maybe I'm just imagining all this, but I think that there's something going on where it's kind of stopping a lot of the experimentation that I used to see. Or maybe that experimentation has changed and I don't quite know what it is yet. But I think we're in a moment of transition in some strange way. I'm not enjoying watching all of the kind of book banning stuff that's going on. I'm not enjoying the way that corporate publishing is kind of like taking over. AI is doing weird things. I heard about a publisher that's opening up that will be publishing 1,200 books next year, all written by AI. Things like that. Like, it's a really strange moment, I think. And it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I'm so happy to have made it through 20 years. We're in our 21st year now. I'm really excited for the books we're doing this year and the stuff we'll be doing in 2026 as well. Um, uh, but I don't know. There's also part of the sort of traditional publishing that I'm doing. I think a lot of people look at it in a kind of dinosaur-y sort of way. Where's the shiny technology? And I go and I lobby to the government all the time on behalf of literature and publishing, and all they want to know is what is the shiny gadget that we're going to make. And we're like, we're still making the codex. 500 years later, still exists. And a lot of the technology that's been invented, that's gone. But Shakespeare's first folio still got it. So in terms of like information storage, the book is where it's at as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
That's a lovely last note to end on, I think. And then we'll segue into your own work, which will be
Yeah.
a really great way to close up the hour.
All right. Well, I thought I'll read at least one poem. I don't know how long it will take me, but it's the past little while because I've been so busy with running the press. I also run a online bookshop that's called Apollinaire's Bookshop. It specializes in all the books that no one wants to buy. So I tend to find ways to build poems. I'll invent a form or something like that. And so like, for instance, just before I turned 50, I was feeling very lost and a little strange about the world that we were living in. It was during the pandemic and stuff. So I started, and I had no desire to write anything on social media. So every time I had the urge to write something on social media, I would write it down in my notes app instead. And then that became this book here called Offline, which is a chapbook published by Encyclopedia Press. It has wonderful thoughts in it, like if we start with the premise that poetry does not exist, we may find ourselves closer to the poem in its purest form. Anyway, there's 50 thoughts in here. It took me about 3 years to write it. And I'm not going to read from that. What I will read is another poem. It's part of a larger project that I've been working on. My name is Jay. That's the 10th letter in the alphabet. I'm kind of fascinated by, I'm sorry, I'm being interrupted by something. Just a sec. Yeah. Any time for that? Sorry, delivery. My name is Jay. That's the 10th letter in the alphabet. I'm kind of fascinated by tens. And many years ago, I'd written a book called J, a metric system that used a particular form of counting through the alphabet by tens. And then for some reason, I thought I would try it again, but ramp it up a bit. So I created this form where each of the poems has 10 stanzas of 10 lines that are written in with 10 syllables per line. And the first letter of each line counts through the alphabet by 10. I thought it would take me a few months. It's been a couple of years. I'm on what's called Canto 6. I'm going to read you Canto 3. Canto 3. Lately, the brutal god of white logic, unbounded by the fragility of men, dances the mock butterfly to the tune, "My thoughts are very precious, as am I." Visually, it is the sound of bees encroaching on a meal, something like eggs neatly laid before you by a chicken who wants you to devour the future and fight for nothing you already own. Once evil is endured, it is always fixed on compassionate grounds, forever grieving, and lets you know how old you are, primarily caught somewhere between how you see yourself and how others see you. Heroes of economy feed on the quarrelsome bones of rich men, a movement zest that banks on time, your one true asset. I want these poems to express nothing, repeating endlessly until I know. A woodpecker telegraphs the morning, just as the wind queries the lake with a soft breeze. Everything is calm, sun-speckled, bionic horns at the end of summer, killing time and enjoying the murder. To say death is illogical opens certain lines of prosody, a cage of longing, and the sum of your genes crying undulating headlines in bold letters. disaster and its aftermath, rhyming, marvelous, and touched. Biological vanity and the currency we bought enough of to define ourselves as a need. Cary Grant on LSD, a new wonderful italicized form of the fully realized American male. On the dashboard, a carnivorous group exalted and hopeless to foretell the gestalt of the marvelous synchronized platforms begging deeply for attention. Yesterday, the hyacinth was poised to host a blossom, and this morning it is questioning my gaze. Once I had strength to gaze outward as an intellectual, I now find it requires work to think. Really, to think about thinking makes it a tepid word, one that will never say just what it means, nor consider it a satisfying goal to stop in one place. Beyond the moment in which it appears, kept at bay by culture itself, or by the mercy of what I perceive as your consciousness, which is an object, like a lemon, a toy truck, or even a coin under a sheet of paper suddenly discovered and pocketed, refusing me anything because I only know visions of my own mind as it lights up everything you might possibly become. Never mind, I still love you and all your wondrous objectivity. Still, my feelings are downloading a guide to living off-grid. Isn't it funny how one can explain a position to themselves and grasp the concept of local gardening, power cords slicing through a field of joy, yearning for growth left alone to be growth, hoping no one will notice how humans quashed the future under the thumb of a zombie-like view of the past, a past that isn't even real, that people seem to respond to with glee. Imagine progress as traveling backward through a time to a joke with no punchline. As one's habitat shifts across the land, the relationship between people and nature collapses, kinetic infrastructure of these days. Time whispers at the seasons, soothing a community to sufferers, hosting laugh-ins where they can be vulnerable, using mirrors and hothouses as the diverging paths through each metaphor, bright meritocratic nodules that exist to verify a certain rigor that I envy and perhaps love. And so, gazing now through the window, I consider a world warped profoundly by a language we found here and there, objects that remember others who died, not their true or real selves exactly, but holographic bits that gloam as a suggestion, fragments that the phenomenology of a stanza yearns to capture, tilt, and redistribute, hoping you won't notice that overtly quiet sound of these overlooked faces, zoning out under words that stand for trees. Irrefutable in its soft longing, reliable in its impermanence, anything beautiful to humans is just out of luck, basically, which means our secret will is to continue living. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, thanks to all three of you for joining us. We really appreciate the time and the thoughts. And thanks to Fong, Bui, and the whole team at the Brooklyn Rail. Really appreciate this space, as we always do.
Thank you, Cole. Thank you, Liz, Stephen, Jay, and Cole for the conversation today. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. Join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a Director's Series conversation with Madeline Grinstein, Joaquin Pizarro, and Jennifer Stockman on the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago. And as it is a Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye,
Take care
guys.
today.
Thanks,
Thanks, y'all.
Jane. Really appreciate your presence.
Yes. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you.